Morning, folks. It's Bradley J. and the Bradley J. Show. And as is the case on a lot of Fridays, we have Rich Rubino here with us, a political historian, and sometimes he can be coaxed into a little commentary. Hi, Rich.
Hi, Bradley. Thanks so much for having me on again this week.
Absolutely. This week we are talking about presidents who have attempted to reacquire the office, having been president and then not, and then trying to get back in. And this is going to be good because I wonder how that tends to turn out. Probably generally not very well because we don't hear about it very much. And then we'll maybe talk about this particular attempt by this particular president. So, Rich, do take it away. I guess you would start by listing the folks who have tried and taking them one by one, but in any order you like.
Sure, absolutely. We can certainly go chronological. So you go back in history, and the first one that really tried it was Martin Van Buren. So Martin Van Buren was president from 1837 to 1841. He had a pretty unsuccessful term. There was a panic an economic depression. Martin Van Buren was largely blamed for it. He was a Democrat, but at the time the Democrat was the conservative party, very much a libertarian party, as a matter of fact.
What year
And
was it? What years were these?
he was in 1837 to 1841.
Man, what was going on in the country at that time? That's kind of a dead spot in
Oh, interesting.
my knowledge.
So he was vice president under Andrew Jackson in the second term of Andrew Jackson's administration. Andrew Jackson was relatively popular during his administration, but at the end of his administration, essentially there was a Great Depression, and Martin Van Buren essentially had to deal with it, and that was the main issue going on in the country was the economic downturn, huge unemployment around the country. And Van Buren comes in, and he's basically a conservative libertarian who believes that only market forces should be able to ameliorate the economy. So consequently, he believed the federal government should do almost nothing.
Hmm.
Here's an example. He literally had the White House tools sold so they could not be used for public works projects. That's how conservative Martin Van Buren was at that time.
Hmm.
So the problem was at the time there was an uprising almost economically in this country, and people wanted something different. So accordingly, in 1840, Martin Van Buren lost his reelection bid to William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison was essentially the first candidate who I think really ran as a media-induced candidate. It's fascinating how he actually won that year. He was from a patrician background, very wealthy, but he lived for a small period of time in a log cabin after he was in the military. So one time, a newspaper reporter was kind of pillaring him and making fun of him, and said, "Oh, Martin Van Buren making fun of him because he would give these long harangues, these long speeches, and he was known to like philosophy. Oh, you just give him a little bit of philosophy and give him a jug of hard cider and have him sit on the porch and he will basically won't and it's a log cabin. He won't ever have to bother us because he's never going to run for president because he's not charismatic, anything else." So William Henry Harrison's political campaign took that and they essentially made it into a positive by saying he's the log cabin candidate. He's one of us. So they would make these big. They had these bottles they would make, and this guy named E.G. Booze, and you'd put whiskey in it, and it would make it look like it was a log cabin, and that's where the word booze came from. Fascinating how this all worked out,
So he made bottles shaped like a log cabin.
and to show that William Henry Harrison was the log cabin candidate.
Uh-huh. Okay, I'll
And
remember that forever.
yes, absolutely.
That's a good one.
So
Okay.
William Henry Harrison wins that campaign, and Martin Van Buren, of course, loses. So Martin Van Buren goes back to New York, but his political ambitions are not over. So a couple years later, he comes back and tries to run for president again, but this time he does not do it as a Democrat. He leaves his political party. This is probably the biggest fear, I think, for establishment Republicans that Donald Trump does the same thing and runs as an independent. But Martin Van Buren, what happened at the time? So essentially, there was the kind of these weird third parties. Republicans hadn't really popped up yet, but there's a party called the Free Soil Party, and the Free Soil Party was basically anti-slavery, and that's one thing Martin Van Buren was. So he essentially ran on that party's ticket. And what he did in that race in 1848 is he helped to split the votes in his home state of New York, which happened to actually benefit Zachary Taylor, and Zachary Taylor ended up winning. So in many respects, he was kind of a spoiler in that campaign. That's Martin Van Buren's real role. He got about 10% of the vote. He wasn't really necessarily a major player. People kind of looked upon him as essentially at the time as kind of a failed president, if you will. But that's what happened, and then Zachary Taylor lands up winning. And Zachary Taylor's running mate, Millard Fillmore, the inimitable Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore comes in, and when Zachary Taylor dies in 1850, Millard Fillmore was not win re-election, but he goes, so after he loses in 1852, he goes around the country, and goes around the world. And interestingly, in 1856, there was a party called the Know Nothing Party, and Millard Fillmore was never associated with. And Know Nothing Party was basically a mecca in the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They literally had the entire congressional delegation at one point after the 1854 elections, the governor, and the entire and almost the entire state house. Governor Gardner, for example, the governor of Massachusetts during that time period, because they were basically anti-immigrant. And the reason they called them Know Nothing, people would ask them after they would go through meetings, they say, "What did you talk about at that meeting?" They would say, "I know nothing." So they're really called the American Party, but their nickname, their appellation, if you will, was the Know Nothing Party. So Fillmore wasn't even in the country at the time, and he wasn't really that anti-immigrant. But the party was looking for somebody with a name. So someone said, "Why don't we nominate Millard Fillmore?" And they did. And Millard Fillmore finds out about this, and he accepts the nomination. Campaigns around the country, but when he came, what they did, by the way, back then, a lot of the campaigning was actually done by surrogates, but they did do a little bit of campaigning, but most of it was kind of from their house, if you will. So Millard Fillmore ran essentially about unity. His campaign was about how we need to unify over the slavery issue. For example, we need to bring the country together. He didn't really bring up some of the more truculent anti-immigrant stances during that election time. So he wins 21% of the vote. It's actually very good for a third party, and wins the state of Maryland. So that was Millard Fillmore in 1856. Of course, James Buchanan lands up winning that race, and he defeated actually John C. Fremont. And John C. Fremont was really the first Republican presidential candidate. 4 years later, of course, the party nominates Abraham Lincoln.
Before you go on,
Yes.
let's take a minute to think about what life was like in about 1850. So there's no indoor plumbing at all.
Yes, absolutely, or electricity.
There's no anesthesia. So if you need an amputation, you just bite a bullet, and there's no anesthesia.
Yep, just like when the Three Stooges were dentists.
And I invite anybody, whether they're watching this live now or whether you're watching it after the fact, to think about what else was different about life back then. I guess you wash your hands, you'd had a bowl with water, you'd pour water, hot water, you'd have to heat it up on the stove. It's just shocking how far technologically we have come. But I think it's interesting to note, and then I'll let you continue, that we think of this as a time of innovation. It's really not compared to the 1890s. The 1880s is the Wild West. And then by 30 years later, 1910, there's electricity, there's all kinds of scientific discoveries. Whereas life really isn't that much different now than it was in, say, in the 60s. Airplanes, they still have the 747s flying around. There's computers and all, but I don't think life changed as much in that 60. So from 1960 to now, 73 years. I don't know if life changed more in the 70 years than it did in those 30 years back then, because that was the time of invention. But before that, in the 50s, the 1850s, we're talking about, it was horses,
literally,
and not paved roads, and no plumbing, and just something to think about. When we think of people campaigning and riding around, there must have been trains, or were there trains? They hadn't really expanded westward yet.
There were actually Franklin Pierce took a train to Washington, for example. Okay. There certainly were trains, but certainly if you wanted to go abroad without an airplane, you literally have to take a boat. So Millard Fillmore going around other countries, and I'm going to talk with Ulysses Grant doing the same thing. You literally would have to take a boat if you were going overseas.
And the West was still a territory then, right?
Yeah,
in 1850. And when we're talking the West, that's everything that's not the East and not the Louisiana Purchase. All that whole Southwest thing is what Is it still Mexico at that point, or
No, well, actually, a lot of that's very interesting. That's an interesting time. Actually, the Mexican-American War was in the 1840s under James K. Polk, and James K. Polk brought in a lot of that land to the United States after that,
okay?
certainly after that war. But and then Texas actually came in under President John Tyler. So some of these states were coming in, and this is part of the issue actually in terms of slavery. There were really three positions on slavery. There was an abolitionist who said, bring all slavery to a halt, end all slavery. That was one wing. They're called the radical Republicans within the Republican Party. On the other side, there were people who essentially said that they support slavery, mostly Southerners. Then there was essentially the middle, which is what Abraham Lincoln was, which essentially said slavery should be decided, states have sovereignty to decide it themselves, but I'm against it in the Western Territory. And that was essentially Lincoln's compromise position. So he wasn't a radical Republican on the one hand, and on the other hand, he wasn't a supporter of slavery, but he said we do not need slavery in the new territory. So the issue was, what do we do with it? What do we do with this new territory? Do we have slavery?
So was each time there was a state, there was a controversy, right? Was it the Missouri Compromise?
Yeah, where Missouri came in as a slave state and Maine comes in essentially as a free state. And Maine, of course, was prior to that part of Massachusetts.
Yes, and that's why we have the pine cone on top of the State House.
Yes, yes, yes.
As we learned from Representative Michael Day, 31st District, during a recent little history lesson from him on the State House. Okay, so back to, where do we leave off? Fillmore?
Right after Fillmore, this is an interesting example that came after this. So Ulysses S. Grant becomes president, wins in 1868, serves 2 terms, reelected in basically a landslide in 1872. The Democrats that year didn't even field a candidate. Instead, there was a group called the Liberal Republicans, and the Democrats, Horace Greeley was their nominee. The Democrats supported the third party nominee that time, so he was relatively popular. Second term gets in a little bit of there's a scandal involving essentially, it's called credit mobilier, but basically I'll say it's about bribery in terms of congressmen taking bribes. Some congressmen supported a retroactive pay raise. The Republican Party was absolutely excoriated by the electorate in the 1874 midterm elections. The thought is Grant's going to go home. He did. He briefly thirded with running for president in 1876. Some newspaper called it Caesarism, meaning he'd be there forever, essentially. So he goes home, and then in 1878, he takes a world tour. He goes all around the country for like 2 years on and off, and he becomes really popular, not so much for his presidency, but because of his role in winning the Civil War. So consequently, in 1880, Roscoe Conkling, a senator from New York, who's really kind of almost omnipotent, hegemonic in the Republican Party in the stalwart wing. The stalwart wing were basically Republican insiders who did not believe in civil service reform. They believed essentially in the status quo. He wanted Ulysses S. Grant to run for president. And Ulysses S. Grant sees his popularity and says, okay, if you put my name in, I'll be a candidate. There's no primaries at the time, so it was all decided at the Republican National Convention. So he puts his name in, and Grant actually wins the plurality on the first ballot. And so that he would have been the first president to serve 3 terms. This was before the 22nd Amendment, so it's completely categorically constitutionally permissible. So Grant runs for president, and then there's really a deadlock. One of the candidates is James G. Blaine, the Speaker of the House from Maine. James G. Blaine, the Continental Liar from the state of Maine, was when they used to make fun of him. He was essentially also a stalwart, so they were running for the same constituency. Then there was John Sherman, a former senator from Ohio, Treasury Secretary under the incumbent president who's only serving 1 term, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. And James Garfield, a congressman from the state of Ohio, gets up there and delivers essentially an oration praising John Sherman. And all of a sudden, it's deadlock convention, people start yelling, we want Garfield, we want Garfield. Think about how this works now. Garfield is a congressman who's probably, the Republicans had basically chosen him as the next senator from Ohio. At the time, the legislatures chose who was going to be the senator, so they didn't have direct elections until 1913. So this congressman is relatively obscure nationally. And he was part of the reason he was run re-election is he actually wrote a letter to his constituents in Ohio explaining why he was against the retroactive pay raise. So we survived the 1874 midterm shellacking by the Republican Party. But consequently, they start yelling, "We want Garfield." Garfield says, "No, I'm here to nominate my favorite son candidate, Sherman." Sherman was known as the Ohio Icicle because he was very uncharismatic and he was from Ohio. And on the 36th ballot, James Garfield garners the nomination. Think about this. A member of the House of Representatives who's going to be a senator, all of a sudden is a presidential candidate. And he does accept the nomination and goes on to win. So Grant had tried that in 1880. But here's the most important one. Here is the archetype or the precedent, if you will, that Donald Trump will use if he thinks, if looking at, is there any history of a president who loses and comes back? And it's Grover Cleveland. So Grover Cleveland was the governor of New York, basically a meteoric rise, goes from mayor of Buffalo to governor of New York within a couple of years. In 1884, wins the Democratic presidential nomination. Then in 1888, he wins the popular vote, but loses in the Electoral College, just like Donald Trump. I mean, just like Al Gore, for example, just like Hillary Clinton, for example. So Benjamin Harrison wins. And the day Grover Cleveland, when he was president, he was 46 years old. He actually married in the White House. Only president to actually marry in the White House. Was called the Executive Mansion at the time, before Theodore Roosevelt changes to the White House. And so and on the last day, when they were packing, the first lady said to Frances Folsom Cleveland, said to the staff, said, "Keep the place nice. We'll be back in 4 years." Now, there's no electricity, by the way. And under Benjamin Harrison's administration, electricity comes to the White House. Benjamin Harrison, by the way, was trepidatious of electricity. He would literally not turn the lights out. So in 1890s, he goes back and he practices law in New Jersey. And he's looking, he says, well, could I potentially be a candidate again in 1892? Because it was basically a split verdict on the electorate. People were basically kind of undecided about it. So he thinks about running. And at the end, he decides he's going to run at the convention. And he actually has two opponents this time. There was Horace Boyce, who was the governor of Iowa. And then there was David Hill, a fellow New Yorker. And this is interesting because David Hill was basically an understudy for Cleveland. When Cleveland was governor of New York, Hill was lieutenant governor. When Cleveland moved on to become the presidency, Hill moved up and becomes governor of New York. So they had been allies, but then they split. A lot of it was over personal issues. Some of it was over the issue of bimetallism. Grover Cleveland very much was a supporter of the gold standard, did not want more currency. His opponent, David Hill, did want more currency. So you have these two former allies running against each other for president at the convention in 1892, and Cleveland subsequently wins. Cleveland defeats David Hill, and he's the nominee again, runs for president. Benjamin Harrison was somewhat unpopular. He had spent a lot of money. He had the first $1 billion Congress. He actually had given a lot of veterans Civil War pensions, which started to explode the budget in many respects. So Cleveland runs. And Cleveland this time around beats Benjamin Harrison. So Cleveland's the only person, other than Franklin Roosevelt in American history, another New Yorker there, who's actually won the popular vote 3 times. He won it in 1884, he won it in 1888, and he won it again in 1892. 2 of those times he actually won the Electoral College as well. So he becomes president, and just like Martin Van Buren, Cleveland and Van Buren there's some eerie similitudes here. Becomes very unpopular because just like Martin Van Buren, there's a Great Depression in 1893, the beginning of his administration, and Cleveland does almost nothing about it. People come and protest. They say, please, 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 we have unemployment over the country. Please, 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 we want economic reform. We want stimulation. Grover Cleveland, his second administration, does virtually nothing. It becomes a null set in terms of what he will do economically. 1894, the party has the biggest loss of any party in American history in those midterm elections. Absolutely gets wiped out. Cleveland becomes extremely unpopular. And in 1896, the party, Cleveland, does not run for president again. He's very unpopular. And the party instead nominates William Jennings Bryan, a former 2-term congressman from Nebraska, who had the Republicans had chosen as their Senate candidate in 1894, but the Democrats won the legislature. The guy was 36 years old. He gives a speech called the Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic National Convention. Basically the first liberal Democrat to ever win the nomination. The people wanted somebody who was going to stimulate the economy economically. So William Jennings Bryan wins the nomination. Cleveland becomes thunderstruck by this and doesn't even support his party's nominee. Instead, he goes on and supports John M. Palmer, 79-year-old senator from Illinois, running in the quote-unquote National Democratic Party that year. So that's the next example. Then Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. He was also a governor of New York, just like Grover Cleveland. He became vice president under William McKinley in 1901. McKinley dies in his first term in office. Roosevelt's up in the Adirondacks, finds out about this. He's president. In 1904, he runs for re-election, defeats the Justice Elton Parker in a landslide, and the next day he says, I'm not going to stand for my full term in 1908, and he kept to that. So in 1908, you had William Howard Taft running for president at the convention, which was handpicked by Theodore Roosevelt. Charles Fairbanks, the vice president, I think Theodore Roosevelt thought was too conservative, so he did not support his own vice president. Well, they weren't really, I mean, back then they weren't really necessarily, it wasn't like the president picked the vice president, like the convention picked somebody to essentially split the ticket. So you had a progressive in Theodore Roosevelt and a conservative in Charles Fairbanks. So in 1908, William Howard Taft wins the presidency, and Theodore Roosevelt thinks he's going to be progressive. And he actually was relatively progressive, but not progressive enough for Theodore Roosevelt. So in 1912, at the Republicans Party, now the primaries had just began. They were in kind of the inchoate status, if you will. Theodore Roosevelt runs for the Republican nomination and wins the majority of the votes in the primaries. But you know who was hegemonic back then? It was not the primary voters. It was the conventions. So subsequently, the convention said, all the political bosses, today we might call them superdelegates, if you will, we want William Howard Taft, so William Howard Taft wins the nomination. Theodore Roosevelt says, I'm stripped to the buff, and I will throw my hat into the ring. He literally, this is where the slogan came from. And he runs for president himself as a member of the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, 1912. Basically, he splits the vote with, he splits the Republican vote with William Howard Taft between the progressive bloodline and the conservative wing, and that helps Woodrow Wilson win. Personally, I think Woodrow Wilson would have won anyways. After William Howard Taft lost, he said he came in third place. He said he's won the ex-presidency. He's been elected former president. That was kind of the joke that he made because he did, bet more than any other person who's ever been elected former president. So that was what happened. Theodore Roosevelt considered running again in 1916, didn't in 1919. He was thinking about running in 1920. Of course, he ended up dying at 60 years old in 1919, and that never happened. Now, here's an interesting, you're going to notice some consanguinity here because I talked earlier about Martin Van Buren and Grover Cleveland being presidents during depressions. Well, so was Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover runs in 1928 and says, I support a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. And basically he was talking about how the country is in prosperity. And it was. And he was been Commerce Secretary under Grover Cleveland. Under Calvin Coolidge, rather. He wins the nomination, wins the presidency, and there's a depression. The Great Depression. He actually does try something. He tries the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And the Smoot-Hawley tariff largely fails. There were retaliatory tariffs. Some blamed Hoover for that. He loses miserably, only won 6 states in the election to Franklin D. Delano Roosevelt, extremely unpopular, goes home. But interestingly, in 1936, he gave an address at the Republican National Convention. His name was actually put into nomination for presidency that year. Of course, he ended up losing to Kansas Governor Alfred Landon, but his name was put in. Basically, he gave a speech excoriating Franklin D. Roosevelt. 1940, same thing. Herbert Hoover's name is again at the convention. He gives a speech talking about basically supporting non-interventionism, and Franklin D. Roosevelt of course, is elected to an unprecedented third term. Now, there's one other example which is kind of interesting, is Gerald Ford. So Gerald Ford he was never elected president or vice president. He was a congressman from Michigan, elected 13 times, minority leader in the House. Nixon chose him as vice president after Spiro Agnew pleaded no loc contendere, no contest to one charge, essentially of tax evasion. So Nixon chose Ford, and the House and the Senate overwhelmingly supported him. The Senate, I think only 3 people voted against him. Ford becomes vice president, then Watergate, Ford becomes president. 1976, he runs in his own term. For his own term, was down by 31 points at one point to Jimmy Carter, and ends up losing by about a point. And then in 1980, Ronald Reagan, who had actually challenged Ford for the nomination in 1976, the Reagan people have this idea, because Ronald Reagan is seen as being too conservative for the electorate. They say, what about if we bring Gerald Ford on as a vice president, so a co-presidency, if you will? The only time this has ever really been proposed. And Ford seriously considered it, but essentially said that Ronald Reagan would not give him enough power. So he said, he was actually interviewed on television, said he would not accept it. So George H.W. Bush ended up getting the presidency instead. So this brings us to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's trying for his own unprecedented term his own unprecedented non-consecutive term. Here's something fascinating. Every single person I brought up just now, other than Gerald R. Ford, at one point in their life had lived in New York. Grover Cleveland was the governor of New York. Martin Van Buren was from New York. Herbert Hoover had lived in New York. He actually ended up retiring in New York. Grant had lived in New York at one point. So this is commonality. These are all New Yorkers that have tried for a non-consecutive term. And Grover Cleveland, of course, is the only person who was actually successful in that endeavor.
Question on one thing, one area. Teddy Roosevelt died. He lived such an interesting life. Did he die in some interesting way?
I don't believe so. I think he just kind of died in his sleep. But he was 60 years old, and right when he died, they said that essentially he died very young. And after he had actually left the presidency, he actually went on an African safari, which was interesting. And he thought he would never, try to regain it. But he was very young. And at the time, by the way, this was prior to the 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment was passed after Franklin Roosevelt. It says that a president can only serve essentially 2 consecutive terms. Now, there's a little stipulation. Lyndon Johnson, for example, came in at the tail end of Kennedy's term. He could have run for re-election in 1968 because there is a time limit in terms of when you can serve part of your predecessor's term.
I'm sort of surprised. It's a sad thing about Johnson. We actually didn't we do it?
Oh, we did, and it was just the anniversary of his 50th. The anniversary of his the 50th anniversary of his death was actually last week.
So Lola Pope coming to us from Maine, the great state of Maine, formerly Massachusetts.
Formerly Massachusetts.
How is our? As you can see, the question is, how has our democracy survived all these vast swings and the tides of political leaders and policies?
Oh, that's an excellent question.
Do you have an excellent answer?
I don't know about excellent, but I have an answer.
Okay. All right.
Part of it is that is a fascinating question. Generally speaking, most leaders have been either center left or center right. So consequently, we have not had a lot of leaders that are so extreme to the point that there would be a protest or a riot. Essentially, when people take politics, politics is war by other means, is what Clausewitz, the great military historian, used to say. Generally speaking, we've also had political leaders who have agreed to leave at the end of their terms. If they lose re-election, they do not try to stay in the generally do not try to stay in the White House. And after 8 years, with actually Grant was kind of an exception, interesting, because there was a disputed election in 1876 between Hayes, the governor of Ohio, and Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York. And Grant actually came up with this ideation, maybe what if I serve out a little more of the term during this disputed election, but eventually they agreed to make Hayes the president. I just think that also the other part of it is we have never been in such a state where we have not been depoliticized. By that, I mean, if you think about it, most people that are, if you're on Twitter and you're on social media, you think everyone's interested in politics and everyone follows this all day. But in reality, the average voter, first of all, is 54 years old. Most people are kind of depoliticized. They're interested in politics, but it doesn't consume them all day long. Now, what potentially could do that? And what has done that? And I hope I'm answering the question. The first thing is the Civil War. And there were huge riots, one of the biggest riots in American history in New York City that year, especially if a war is unpopular. The other would be Vietnam. And in Vietnam, it was relatively popular at the beginning of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. But as you get to 67, 68, and there were protests, hey, LBJ, how many boys did you kill today? Johnson literally, his Secret Service advised him that they could not guarantee his safety unless he was on military installations. So wow. if he goes to a college campus, you can do that, but it's at your own risk. If you go out campaigning for Hubert Humphrey in 68, you can do that, but it's at your own risk. So there was a time, I think, at that point where we almost was kind of an uprising. And I think that if Nixon had continued Vietnam past 1972, potentially there could have been essentially, almost, I think of it, I'm trying to compare it a little bit to what happened at the end of the Cold War, when there were essentially riots and after Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin kind of came in. So I think that we have survived that because we have never been, politics in many respects is personal. And I say that because if something directly affects the person, by that I mean not just intellectually, but if it directly affects you and someone's going to send you off to war and you're 18 years old, then you're going to have a lot of protests. By the way, as an aside, a perfect example of this, remember from the Jersey Shore, Snooki?
Yeah.
Well, Snooki came. So Snooki was somebody who was very depoliticized. And in 2010, Obama proposes the Affordable Care Act, which passed. And in it, there was a surcharge on tanning beds. So Snooki, of all people, comes out and says, "I think he's doing this purposely for us." Why? Because she likes to go tanning. That directly affects her. So, not that there's going to be a riot over tanning, but that's why I think we basically have survived. But I will say that many on the right will say that part of the reason we survived is that we're not a democracy, direct democracy, where everyone essentially gets to town hall meetings, and
Right.
like an Athenian type of thing, and we all just make our decisions on a plebiscite. But we essentially elect leaders, and we elect them. We say, all right, you're going to be our state rep, you're going to be a congressman, you're going to be a president, so you're going to make the decisions for us. We're not going to be making the decisions ourselves.
So Lola asked if Nixon had stayed in office. Do you think might have been riots after Watergate?
Yeah, I do think there would have been. As you saw, there were a lot of protests after Gerald Ford pardoned him. But I do think there's certainly, because part of that is because of what Nixon's popularity was. He was the most second on. He was very popular. He was at 68, 70%. He won at one point. He won re-election, winning 49 states. Massachusetts and District of Columbia, the only places he lost that year. Very popular. Watergate brought him down to 24%. Only Truman, at the end of his term, at 22% was less after the Korea debacle.
Okay.
Richard, here's
Nixon,
the. Yep.
if Nixon was so low, why does Trump remain so high
I think because Nixon,
comparatively?
yeah, part of it was because Nixon did not have did not really have a conservative base that would die for him.
I see.
He had been, when he ran for president himself the first time in 1960, many conservatives held their nose and voted for him because they thought he was essentially too moderate. 1968, he ran as a compromise candidate. You had Nelson Rockefeller running, the governor of New York, as a liberal Republican, and there was a formidable, redoubtable liberal Republican constituency. Ronald Reagan running to the right as a conservative. So he was basically a compromise candidate. He wasn't a lot of people's first choice. And a lot of people did not like him, but they essentially voted for him because they thought that he could win. So when Nixon becomes president, he supported he established the EPA, for example. He went to China. This inflamed people on the conservative end. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the SALT talks, essentially détente with the Soviet Union. So the conservatives were never really all in with him. John Ashbrook ran against him that year in the Republican primary. Then he had John Smits, a Republican, an independent former Republican who ran against him in 1972 as an American Party candidate. So he was never really had a consolidated base. So consequently, there were not a lot of people who were out there who were going to die for Richard Nixon like they would somebody like Donald Trump, because Donald Trump really captured the imagination. So I think there's 37% of this country that will never leave Donald Trump over basically almost anything. I think in Nixon's case, that was really about 15%.
Do you think it's possible Donald Trump will run as a moderate, taking a look and position himself that way against the extreme Freedom Caucus, which, by the way, he created? He created this extreme wing in the House, and he can use those very people to position himself as a moderate if he wanted. And he seems to be he's not out doing many live off the book things yet, but it seems like he's being a little subdued and a little more moderate. Maybe. What do you think? Will he take the risk of alienating his super conservative folks in an attempt to get some moderate votes?
Here's what's interesting. I don't think, and I think this happened first of all, in 2000, he was seriously considering running as a Reform Party candidate, basically running as a moderate. But he really, last time, I rarely heard him use the word conservative. It was more populist. And on some litany of issues, Social Security, he recently said, don't touch Social Security, talking to Kevin McCarthy.
Right.
In 2020, in 16, when he ran, he taught him and Mike Huckabee, the former governor of Arkansas, the only candidates who said, don't try to partially privatize Social Security, don't Medicare, support social services. So I don't think he's necessarily, and on trade, he's essentially said, yeah, we need tariffs to essentially protect our workers. So I don't think, by supporting protective tariffs, accordingly, I don't think he necessarily ran so far to the right as terms of somebody said, you know what, we're going to make government de minimis. You're just going to have fire. You're going to have police. And that's essentially it. He never really said that. He essentially said, I'm going to do the same thing the Democrats are going to do, but I'm also going to be a social conservative.
Somehow, though, he did manage to make the super conservatives his fans.
Yes.
Maybe just because there's only it's just there's not much of a choice. That could be.
Well,
I don't know.
interestingly, when he ran in 2016, a lot of those super conservatives, that was not his base. That was Ted Cruz's base. That was Ben Carson's base, the evangelicals. That was Rand Paul's base, the libertarians. Many thought of Donald Trump. Ted Cruz used to basically say that he was a New York liberal. He had New York values, he said. He said that on Howie Carr's show. He says Donald Trump has New York values. They were very incredulous of him. Now, what has he done as president to really bring them so that they just essentially genuflect to them? In terms of many in the evangelical community, it's the judges. The judges. That's one thing he has done is he's nominated judges that very conservative judges who are socially conservative and judges that have agreed to who have essentially supported the Hobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade. So consequently, they may not like his personal lifestyle. They may not like him on some economic issues, but for social conservatives, whom the flagship or the paramount issue, if you will, is social issues, he's essentially been there for them.
Okay, let's finally take a look at how his race is shaping up this time.
Oh yes,
there's not a whole lot going on yet. There's DeSantis. He's trying to scare DeSantis away, and Nikki Haley.
Yes, Nikki Haley.
And so we kind of know about DeSantis, I guess. The question is, how do you think Nikki Haley might fare?
Yeah.
And where does she fall on the spectrum, on the scale?
Right now, she doesn't have name recognition, but that's going to change because obviously she's going to have a super PAC. There will be a super PAC for her. There's going to be spending a lot of money on her. So the first thing you have to remember, because a lot of people are trying to make this a binary choice, it's just going to be DeSantis and it's just going to be Donald Trump and there's going to be no other candidates. That's largely not true. The only reason people know about DeSantis is because he got a lot of name recognition during COVID, and that certainly precipitated in the last midterm election when he won 19.4%, the biggest victory of any Florida governor since Democrat Bob Graham back in 1982. But there's going to be a lot of other candidates. Nikki Haley is one. She's somebody who was a former governor, a two-term governor. She served 2 terms. She served 1 term, got reelected as governor of South Carolina. Then Trump picked her as the UN ambassador. She can basically, I think what she probably would say is, I'm a governor with foreign policy experience. So that's basically going to be what I think her platform is. Interestingly, she had said she wouldn't run if Donald Trump runs, and Donald Trump's now going to say essentially, you've been recreant to me. You've said you've been an ingrate to me. So that's going to be very interesting how that plays out. But Nikki Haley, interestingly, the thing I find fascinating about Nikki Haley is because South Carolina is one of the early states. So you're going to have, after Iowa and New Hampshire, you're going to have Nikki Haley running as a South Carolina former governor, and Tim Scott, a potential candidate, the current United States Senator from South Carolina. So you're going to have 2 South Carolinians. And here's something other interesting. Harry McMaster, who was lieutenant governor under Nikki Haley, succeeded him as governor, and Lindsey Graham, the other United States Senator from South Carolina, are two of very few candidates who have endorsed Donald Trump in the primary already. They were actually at his introductory inauguration speech. So they're essentially going against favorite sons of I guess you could say native son or native daughter of the state of South Carolina. And that brings me to another question. New Hampshire, which can be the second state, Governor Chris Sununu, basically said he's seriously considering running. So the question is, how will that affect the New Hampshire primary? Someone with ecumenical name recognition in the state of New Hampshire. But will people in New Hampshire, will they view him? Remember, New Hampshire is a very small state, only 2 congressmen. Will they view him as somebody they would want as president, or somebody that they would want where they say, oh, he's governor, but we don't really see him at a presidential level. So it'll be interesting to see how he does in New Hampshire, and how many state legislators are going to, do they endorse the governor that they've worked with all these times, or do they say, look, I got a free agent, I got all these other people who are not from New Hampshire. The precedent for this I can think of, where it was first of all, one of them was Tom Harkin back in Iowa in 1992. And he was extremely popular in Iowa. The Iowa caucus were first, to the point that Greg Smith, who worked for Bill Clinton, campaign at the time, says essentially we're not going to campaign against the hometown boy. So as a result, everybody stayed out of Iowa. Tom Harkin wins Iowa, and it's a very hollow victory. They said, oh, we should win Iowa. So he got really nothing out of it. But he certainly ran his home state and won. In 2016, Marco Rubio was embarrassed in his home state when Donald Trump ended up actually defeating him in his home state. And in 1992, Bill Clinton actually defeated Jerry Brown in the state of California, where Brown had been a former two-term governor of California. Bill Clinton ended up defeating him there, and that essentially kind of ended Jerry Brown's campaign. So it'll be very interesting to see how Sununu does in New Hampshire and how Tim Scott and Nikki Haley do in South Carolina when there's all these other candidates as well.
I'm glad Rubio was embarrassed. He's not thinking of running again, is he?
He has not closed the door on it, and he was just reelected. The same DeSantis was reelected. He was reelected over a formidable candidate. My guess is he does not run. Part of the problem he had in 2020 is that robotic view of him, and there was in one debate where he kept saying the notion that Barack Obama does not know what he is doing is false. Barack Obama knows exactly what he is doing. And at one point, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie called him out, and he says, "There you go again. You keep saying this." And then Marco Rubio said it again, and he called him out again and went after Marco Rubio for that line again. So my guess is he probably doesn't run, in part because you're already going to have two Floridians in the race. We're going to monopolize all the money, Donald Trump, and presumably if Ron DeSantis runs. So I don't see where his natural constituency for Marco Rubio in Florida and nationally would be.
And a final question, short answer probably. Have we reached a point in the United States where being a woman have we gotten past the point where being a woman is a liability?
I think, yes, I do think so.
Okay.
I do think so. I think that certainly the first major person to be on a ticket was Geraldine Ferraro with Walter Mondale back in 1984. At the time, people were saying, "Oh my gosh, there's a woman on the ticket." When Sarah Palin got on the ticket, there was a little less focus on it. Kamala Harris, I think there was a little less focus on it. I think we are at that time. Generally, there's always going to be, there's always going to be on the margin some issues. And the other issue also, I think that one thing we've learned the whole George Santos thing is how much I think being gay is no longer a liability. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, now you have a scenario. Who would ever thought 20 years ago you would have a scenario where Kevin McCarthy and the Republican Party establishment would be doing all they possibly can to defend a gay Republican? It's rarely even mentioned, and you have a scenario where you have Republicans, some very conservative Republicans supporting enshrining, codifying gay marriage into the United States, into public statute right now, and it's basically a non-issue. Nobody even focuses on. Even the most conservative Republicans who are opposed to gay marriage contemporaneously will say, "Well, I believe that's a state issue." I can't think of very many Republicans who run on social issues like that, on the gay marriage issue. But you go back to 2004, for example. Part of the reason George W. Bush won that race, and Tara Rove was part of this, in some of the states like Ohio, they got essentially ballot initiatives to put into the Constitution that marriage is between man and a woman. So that brought out a lot of conservatives. And in 2008, John Edwards, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Chris Dodd, Bill Richardson, Barack Obama, all the major Democratic presidential candidates were opposed to gay marriage. Now you have a scenario where basically pretty much just about every Democrat elected official in the country, I mean, it's got to be over 95%, now not only supports civil unions, but supports gay marriage.
Do you think on the right that some people might be okay with a gay senator or representative, but not a president, because the optics of that to them may be different?
I think there is some, and let me preface this by saying there is some in the evangelical conservatives who would say that. But that being said, when you look at the polls, even among conservatives, gay marriage is basically a dead issue. And I think that it may be, for some evangelicals, may be uncomfortable with it. But I think that if it was somebody who was against abortion rights, for example, who said that they support the Hobbes decision, my guess is that would be a secondary or tertiary issue for them. I think there's very few that would say, no, that person's gay. There's always going to be that constituency, just like any other constituency, if there was a Jew or if there was a Catholic. But I think it's becoming more and more de minimis every day.
It does seem as though the secondary and tertiary items matter less. The only thing that matters now is, will you forward my agenda? Will you vote?
Categorically.
Will you do the stuff I want to make the world look the way I want it to look? I don't care about your private life. I don't care about your history. don't care if you've been in jail. Well, I don't care about your
In some cases, yes.
criminal history. Just get in there and do what I want. Be a bull in the china shop on my behalf. That's all they care about now.
That's part of Trump's legacy.
Right.
Donald Trump did not live an evangelical life. Certainly, that's one thing I think. Even most of the Christian right will say that has not been his lifestyle. But he came in and he essentially gave them what they wanted. I guess you could say a little bit the same thing. I guess you could say this for Ronald Reagan as well. When Ronald Reagan was governor of California, he signed the Mulford Act, one of the most all-encompassing gun control acts in American history. He saw a therapeutic act, which essentially which was very liberal on abortion. He had raised taxes when he ran for re-election as governor in 1970. He said his feet were in concrete and he would not raise withholding taxes. Gets reelected. There's a budget deficit, and he says, "Well, my feet are starting to come. My feet are starting to come out of that concrete," and raised them. So he essentially was an apostate to conservatism. But when he became president in 1980, and he ran on conservative issues, Republican conservatives essentially forgave him. Even look at back in history, John F. Kennedy, he proposed, and Lyndon Johnson signed one of the biggest tax cuts in American history. But contemporaneously, very few Democrats actually criticized him for that. And there were very many wealthy people who benefited from it.
Yeah. You'd think that former President Trump would be easy to run against. There's so much ready-made stuff that you could just air, like the president in the little dining room next to the Oval Office, just watching January 6th unfold and doing nothing. You think that it would be so easy to campaign against him, but you never know. All right.
Yes, I think Democrats are I think they're salivating about running against Donald Trump because they know that he has a very low ceiling, and they know that he may be if he's at 41%, he's probably not going to get any higher than that.
I heard that Democrats are actually spending money to support Trump because they think that Trump in the general would ensure victory. Have you heard anything about this?
No, but I think I can totally see that scenario. Just like I know there were some gun rights activists, for example, who in 2012 had private fundraisers for Barack Obama because they knew that if Barack Obama got elected, then essentially that would galvanize their base because they'd rather go after Barack Obama and say Barack Obama's in the White House and he's essentially going to support increased gun regulations versus somebody who would not.
Oh, one more question because I'll never think of it ever again. Do you believe that neither party wants to solve certain problems like the southern border problem? They don't want to solve it because they want it as an issue to campaign on. And if they solve the issue, particularly the right, if they solve the issue, then they don't have that leverage of that issue. So they don't really want to solve the problem. Does that make sense?
No, I think, parties aren't monochrome. They're not a monolith. A party itself is not. A party itself is just kind of almost an abstraction. You have to deal with the individuals in that party. And I think that certainly now there some members of the Democratic Party or of the Republican Party that are pure tacticians who are pure, cold, calculated, hard-boiled ideologues or opportunists, and it's all about getting from point A to point B electorally. Yes. Now, are there other members who are members of the solvers caucus in the House, for example, who actually want to solve their problem, who actually want to go back to their constituents and say, I've done something? Yes. But I think that it does raise a question, I guess, what is somebody's actual objective? Like if the dog actually catches the rabbit, what does the dog actually do with it? So much of it is just the chase of it. So if you talk about a volatile issue like immigration, for example, Republicans, certainly the conservatives can keep talking about the border, and Democrats can keep talking about asylum. But if there was actually some sort of a compromise in the center, how would that actually affect them? How would that affect them electorally? And would they actually want there to be a compromise, or do you just want to have the issue? I guess Democrats certainly would they look at the polls, and every time Republican supports anything that would appear to cut the growth of entitlement programs, they can immediately go off and say, from an electoral perspective, he wants to take away your Social Security. If that were to be a non-issue, that potentially would have deleterious effects on them electorally. At least they would not have be able to use that as to their political advantage.
Rich Rubino, you are a gem, a font, flowing, just gushing interesting facts and interesting interpretations. I really appreciate it as always. And if any of you who watch this, can you do us both the favor of following and sharing? Sharing's big. Share it to your town if you would. You know, you live in Brockton, share it to the Brockton Facebook page. So thanks a lot, Rich. We'll talk to you again soon. And bye,
Absolutely.
everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye. Okay, we'll be done in